Hi, South by Southwest. We are all advisory board members for Raising Good Gamers, which is a cross-sector initiative created by the Connected Learning Lab out of University of California, Irvine, and Games for Change that brings together researchers, academics, and industry professionals to catalyze positive change in the culture and climate of online gaming for youth. We are really excited to be here today to talk to you all about some of the work that we have done in our fields and industries to best serve the next generation of gamers. In this discussion, we're going to quickly highlight some of our work in a series of lightning talks, and then we'll follow up with an open panel discussion. I am here with two amazing co-presenters today, Kishonna Gray and Makeda Mays Green, so I will pass it off to them to quickly introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, for introducing us. I'm Kishonna Gray. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Hello, everyone. My name is Makeda Mays Green. I'm the Vice President of Digital Consumer Insights at Nickelodeon, and thrilled to join Kishonna and Jennifer on today's panel for Raising Good Gamers. I like to focus my portion of today's talk on representation in video gaming and the importance of creating a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable landscape. It's no surprise that today's kids are active gamers. In fact, according to a recent study by the Entertainment Software Association and Ipsos, 70% of kids under the age of 18 regularly play video games. And honing in on a younger demographic, we know that gaming is among the top activities on mobile phones as well as tablets, specifically among 6 to 11-year-olds. And video game related content is also among the top 5 content categories viewed by kids on YouTube, which means that kids are not just watching games, they're playing them. It's a part of their entire media ecosystem. But let's focus for a while what they're doing when they are playing. The element of social engagement is strong. Kids do not want to miss out on opportunities for virtual play dates, social connections, and as parents well know, it can become very frustrating when it's time to, quote, leave the party. We know that social influencers are not just limited to the gaming world, they're also household names appearing in ads and on TV shows. And also, the digital playground has in many ways become a substitute for in-person connections. Now, much has been said lately about the rise of video gaming during the pandemic. And while there are many opinions from many people, I like to point out some of the stated benefits, including sanity during uncertain times, socialization, and opportunities for co-engagement. Digging deeper into what kids are seeing, let's talk about who today's kids are. We know that they are the first majority minority. And while gaming is popular across all racial and ethnic groups, people of color are underrepresented as characters and influencers. In fact, a report by Curry's PC World shows that among Game of the Year winners and nominees, there are few opportunities for kids to put themselves in the shoes of people of color. Even among top gaming influencers, the household names I mentioned earlier, we see there is little diversity. And game developers are acknowledging diversity as an industry challenge. According to the latest report from the International Game Developers Association, the lack of overall diversity is among the top 10 factors that influence negative perceptions of the gaming industry. In fact, it's listed at number 7. And when asked what is most important to the growth and success of the industry, more diversity in game content is listed at number 1. So why does representation matter? We know that media is a powerful lens, and reflections on screen can influence thoughts about ourselves and others. To address diversity, Nickelodeon's conducted extensive research to understand kids' perceptions of identity and portrayals in the media. This research was conducted over a series of 3 phases and included qualitative as well as quantitative research. We found that among all kids, self-identity is largely driven by family, friendships, and media, indicating the responsibility that the media bears. We also learned that among kids of color, half disagree with their portrayals in the media. And when it comes to stereotypes, the majority of kids are aware of stereotypes. In fact, among 9 to 12-year-olds, 70% of kids have heard a stereotype. One of the top 10 places where kids are hearing stereotypes, is in video games. Through Raising Good Gamers, we have an opportunity to inform and inspire through insights that connect direct supports and indirect supports. And when it comes to kids, it's important that we continue to conduct research to elevate and amplify their voices in shaping the culture. We can do that through usability research, through formative research, through focus groups, and landscape research. And as we create games, we must ask ourselves the following important questions. Who has a seat at the table? Is the creative team diverse? Decision makers have equitable voices. Do the on-screen characters represent diverse populations? Are character portrayals and storylines authentic and inclusive? Does the content promote empowering images, or does it perpetuate stereotypes? Even down to the detail of artwork, has it been vetted through a DRI lens? Have insights been gathered beyond just the quote-unquote core team? And is the testing sample representative? Through these critical questions, we can challenge ourselves to be accountable and deliver actionable outcomes. Thank you.
That was an amazing presentation, Makeda. And there are so many like connections that I draw from, your work and also into my work. Here's just just a review of who I am. Kishonna Gray, assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Now, what prompted, my interest in the Raising Good Gamers initiative was this event that occurred in the land before time, before times in 2019. There was a Pokemon Go Fest, right? And, Pokemon Go, of course, this is not just like a kids activity. Of course, adults are there, like kind of, it's like an intergenerational kind of gaming. But what was most interesting, about Pokemon Go was the absence of, what I saw was like a visible absence of like Black folks in the space. And also because I know, especially as a nerd, we engaged in Pokemon Go just like other populations, right? But I couldn't get a sense that at the time of what was happening there, where the youth were and where the young folks were. It wasn't until after that, later on in the summer, I had partnered with some of the Chicago public libraries. I was talking to the young folks down there. And the young folks indicated to me that they didn't feel welcome at Pokemon Go, right? So sorry. They told me that whenever they congregated it like in larger groups, like security folks, moved them along, pushed them away, told them to leave. But this is like a common narrative for them, right? They're used to not being able to be welcome. Now, so I think it's very important that we look at a couple maps, right? So whenever these young folks indicated to me that they had to travel north to North Chicago. Of course, if people get a sense of like Chicago, I'm sure a lot of folks are like familiar, of course on the east side, excuse me, you have the lake right there. And then, like the mass of Chicago is like to the west, right? And so when you're closer, the closest parts to the lake, of course, are the more affluent parts, right? And then as you travel like west, you get like less affluent, you start to see more socioeconomic, disadvantaged folks, the neighborhoods, more dilapidated, a lot of divestment, not a lot of industry, not unless it's like industry that pollutes people, which is, that's another story for another day. And also as you go further south, the same kind of trends are occurring. Now, unironically, the people who are occupying the spaces on the west side and the south side are Black and brown folks, right? So you have two maps here. One, the map on the left, that's Inglewood. That's the south side of the city. Now, this is where a lot of the kids were that I work with, and we would connect in the library. So if you look at that middle map in the middle, you see there are some libraries that are located like in the Inglewood neighborhood, right? So these young folks were telling me, and when we met at that library, there were like some summer programs that were happening. So they told me that they weren't able to really like participate. And so for me, I'm new to Pokemon Go, but at the time I wasn't that familiar with Pokemon Go. And so for me, it was a geolocation kind of game. So I'm like, well, how about let's just go play in our neighborhoods? Like, let's just engage. And they said they couldn't because there were no PokeGo stops. And to me, I was like, really, there are no stops at all? And so I pulled up the map, and what I found was that on the north side of the city, there were tons of PokeGo stops. So on this map on the right-hand side, it's a map of like, the South Loop and the museum campus, like, the touristy kind of area. So if you come to Chicago, you're probably hanging out like in those areas. You're probably not coming to hang out in Inglewood, but which is a very beautiful neighborhood, full of, a lot of history and a lot of beautiful folks. But there weren't that many PokeGo stops. So the young folks said there were 2 stops and then they were done. And so they couldn't really participate. So in my mind, I was like, well, why don't we just kind of, I found out, through the website, through the Niantic's website, that we could just apply for some spaces to be a PokeGo stop. Well, those places, well, Niantic says that those places have to be safe. They have to have some historical significance, or have to be like a landmark. And so when we were trying to like register some locations or sites for the south side of Chicago, it was always flagged as like these neighborhoods, like if they don't have sidewalks or they aren't deemed safe enough. Well, think about the narrative that people have of like the south side of Chicago. None of the areas in south side of Chicago, if you go with that narrative, none of them are going to be safe, right? But that's just not the context that people have who live, in their neighborhood, right? Sure, there are like, there's some, there are some violence in some pockets, but people live there every day and they have, they live their lives, so these outside narratives are impacting and dictating that. I'll just also give you a sense of the map that's on the left-hand side. That's Chicago touts itself as being one of the most wired and connected cities in the nation. And this is the hotspot map at the time that this project was going on. But there's only one hotspot, that blue spot that's, to the furthest west. And that is outside of like, where a lot of these folks live. So these young folks are disconnected. They're disconnected in a whole lot. They're not wired. They might not have internet at home. And so a lot of them rely on like these public infrastructures. A lot of them rely on, for instance, the Chicago Public Library, especially during the summer, whenever they're not in school, to maintain their connectivity. And so what I thought would be like a really cool project was, first off, to recognize and acknowledge, the amazing ways that youth still maintain their connectivity, and to also acknowledge this is like a hybrid infrastructure of where these young folks are relying on physical public infrastructures as well as the digital, right? So they need the internet, but they need the physical space that also allows them to like support and be connected to the internet. But I also think that this was a really interesting project to make sense of how young people still participate whenever they are the faces of the digital divide. There are questions about resources and access. There are all these different kinds of like questions, but these young folks still participate. There was another story, outside of Pokemon Go, hopefully my time's okay, but where these young folks were still wanting to play like Fortnite, right? And so some of them didn't have like a console, or they were saving up money so they could buy like an Xbox, but they were able to play using mobile technologies. And I think that's another key component of the reliance or the over reliance on mobile technologies for a lot of these young folks. And I think that's a part of something that's not a part of like the equation, but it's always there like in the background, because we're always thinking about the importance of like mobile technologies. So this is like the paths to how a lot of the young folks, from the young folks that I've seen, of how they're adopting like gaming technologies. A lot of them are playing in their mobile device. They rely on the public Wi-Fi in order to maintain their connectivity, but they also rely on public spaces and having access to safe public spaces. I think that's one of the parts that we also forget about and that we don't factor in. If we were to think about that slide that Makeda had, that last slide that she had up there, where it said, questions that you need to consider, making sure that your teams are diverse and making sure that the perspectives of different people are incorporated. So if we had like a diverse team at that time that said, hey, Pokemon Go is really cool. We made this beautiful project, but what is this going to look like when it's deployed into the world, right? They didn't think about what it might look in like rural areas. Like if there are actually, if there's like an infrastructure to support that in rural places. We didn't think about, what the lasting legacies of like racism and redlining and what that looked like, for instance, on the Chicago's west side and south side, and just thinking about would all these young folks and other people be able to play equitably like in these spaces. So those are some of the conversations that they're starting to have. And so we're partnering, with Niantic to address some of these disparities that were not intentioned. They didn't intend for this to happen, but it actually did. So for instance, the project that we're putting forth with the young folks, well, if COVID wasn't here, we probably would be done already, but COVID happened, so we're not able to be in physical space. So we're trying to modify some things. But I think it's really important that, I incorporated, not just like this technical or this techno kind of solution, but that, it also incorporated like this humanities-based solution, right? So these young folks, a lot of them, didn't realize the beautiful and rich history that their neighborhoods actually had. And so we were able to like go through the archives, dig through the crates, go through the annals of history, so they could see that there's beautiful and rich traditions in their neighborhoods. I remember one young person found that the first Sears that was in Chicago was actually in their neighborhood down there on the south side. There's a corner. Of course, the building's dilapidated now, but that's some cool history. So, we're able to like, connect these young folks, with their history. Now, although their intention is really just to get like a pokey go stop, right? I think it's like, has like a bigger story. And I think that that's like the important thing, that they, have that pride and have that possessive ownership of like their neighborhood, and really combat the narratives that are often placed on, Black folks and Black neighborhoods, especially like on the South Side and the West Side. So we're developing, partnering, Raising Good Gamers is, partnering with Niantic. We're partnering with, UIC and U Chicago, Northwestern, different schools, Malcolm X and Harold Washington, Community College, the U Media Chicago, Chicago Public Libraries, and also with Mask. I think it's important that these groups, that the folks who are on the ground doing this work are the primary folks who are they're like the stakeholders in this space, right? So we want to come and support them because they are the experts in their own lives. We can't come in and tell them anything about their lives. So Mask, it's Mothers and Men Against Senseless Killing. These were the folks who were actually physically in the street, that were there while their young folks were playing Pokemon Go, right? Because sometimes there are maybe like threats of violence. And these folks have been there so their kids can play, so their kids can go outside, so the kids can like just cross the street. So I think it's really important that we partner with the community activists, and partner, with these folks who are there as well, and to provide them with the resources, because, the play only happens, when, like parents and guardians and other folks like are involved in young folks play. So I'll end it at that, because I'm probably have approached my time. But I know we're going to segue into Jennifer's talk. And so I love all of these talks, and we're going to chat a little bit, to talk about like the different like connections between all of our talks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kishonna, for that excellent talk. So much of what you said, I think, is a great segue into what I'm going to be highlighting about my work. One of the things that I really want to harp on and emphasize, actually, in what you said, is the importance of trusting our players and really trusting them as core stakeholders in the process of creating great games, creating great gaming spaces, and just making the entire gaming community more inclusive moving forward. So I think it's really, really crucial. One of the key takeaways that I heard from your talk was it's so crucial to be emphasizing and incorporating actual player voices into our work, whatever it may be. So I'm Jennifer Pierre, as a quick reminder. I'm a user experience researcher at Google Stadia, and I'm really excited to share with you all today a little bit about some of the work that I've done with my team on integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion into the game development process. So this particular work, I think, really highlights one of the takeaways that we're hopefully going to talk about in our conversation after this, which is focusing on cross-sector support to support the next generation of gamers in order to help change the culture of online gaming for everyone. So this is a really important takeaway for me, again, because it really incorporates and requires really caring about our stakeholder representation and including players in how we go about our work. So some of the work that my team did was to support the next generation of gamers by embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, into our research and game development process. So just a quick overview of what Stadia is, in case you don't know. I won't spend too much time on this, but it is Stadia's, it's Google's video game organization. And what's special about it is that it's a console-less or cloud-based video game platform. And our mission is to expand the creation, access, and enjoyment of groundbreaking entertainment powered by all of the great tech at Google. And it used to be broken up into two sectors, Stadia the platform and Stadia Games and Entertainment, which was our original game and content publishing side of Stadia. That was recently shut down, but I wanted to bring it up because a lot of what I talk about today is actually related to the work that I did while part of that team. All right, so as a team, when we were moving through the process of figuring out how to best serve our players as a new gaming organization, we realized that one of the core facts that we had to grapple with is that our player base is growing increasingly diverse. And I think this ties into a lot of what Makeda talked about in the opening of her talk as well, actually. Learning about and establishing an understanding of the fact that currently and future-facing gamers are going to be an increasingly diverse group. So pulled out a couple of stats here. Roughly over half of video game players between the ages of 6 and 29 will be of color in less than 10 years. And currently 10% of all gamers over the age of 18 identify as LGBTQ, but this can be paired with recent research on the fact that 9.5% of US teens identify as LGBTQ+ currently, which suggests that a potentially even higher percentage of LGBTQ+ players will be present in future gaming generations. But despite all of this diversity, players are still fundamentally underrepresented. So again, this ties back to a lot of the poignant and concrete examples that Kishonna pointed out around how players aren't, and gamers of all kinds are not really feeling welcome, for example, in Pokemon Go spaces and others. And this can often negatively affect their sense of belonging and their treatment also in gaming spaces. So a couple of examples here: that Asian Americans see the widest gap in their representation in video games. And this contributes to a general sense of uncertainty and a lack of belonging that can even pull through to doubting the actual breakdown of who plays games. So I think a really concrete example of this is the understanding that, or the finding that the majority of women, even women who play games, assume that most video game players are men. So there's this real disconnect between the core desire to play games and to be a part of the gaming community, but the understanding of who these spaces are actually being built for and the perception of who games are being designed for. So when we were grappling with a lot of these challenges that we had to face as a new gaming org, we realized that these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion have been historically present in our industry, and they actually require a real multi-layered approach to help resolve them. And this motivated for us a cross-sector approach, so combining efforts from academia, from other places in industry, from nonprofits, and others to consider player needs first and foremost as a way to become a more future-facing organization and industry so that we could shift the culture for the better. So what did we do about this? How did we approach this cross-sector kind of multi-layered way to resolve some of these issues, or at least attempt to? So to address this challenge, our team focused on creating an actionable process for considering DEI as a first step, as a core set of considerations in our product development and evaluation process. And we pulled this out as a core way to highlight and represent player needs, to provide support for our current and future players in a way that wasn't just reactive, but also proactive and forward-facing. So we found that a way to implement DEI standards into our work was to build on a lot of the excellent work that had already been done at Stadia on our accessibility teams, where they were really targeting and helping address core physical and cognitive accessibility needs. And we saw DEI considerations as a way to round out that process and provide a foundation for more concrete considerations and discussions of psychological accessibility. So really trying to tackle questions of inclusion and belonging in game spaces. The core goals for this work were to prevent identity-based barriers to play, so really ensuring that any player's identity is not a cause for them to actually feel significant barriers to being involved in a gaming space, or to feel like a game isn't being designed for them or welcoming of them, as well as to identify and encourage areas for proactive inclusion. So just to give a quick overview of some of the key steps that we took to create this rubric, we went through a problem scoping phase where we discussed with our cross-functional stakeholders through a series of informal stakeholder interviews what the core issues were. So really harkening back to some of those stats that I pulled at the beginning, and really talking about through as a group how we were going to understand and address the growing diversity of our player base. Then we moved into goal setting and resource structuring. So we conducted an internal literature review of a lot of core principles and resources in product inclusion and inclusive design, as well as an external lit review that was really the fundamental part of this cross-sector approach. So pulling from theory and different forms of gaming literature, media literature, diversity and inclusion literature, and other nonprofit and think tank resources to really gain a fundamental understanding of how to apply these concepts more concretely and explicitly in the game development process. And then we used that to inform a core rubric that had categories and subcategories for what we should be looking at in terms of things like character representation, narrative representation, and interactive pieces within a game. And again, really tying back to a lot of what Kishonna and Makeda have talked about already, this was a core piece in coming up with a list of questions that we should be asking at core points, and how to ensure that player feedback is being used at every stage of our game development process to help answer those questions and evaluate how we're doing as an org, as specific game teams, or as projects. Then we moved into a feedback gathering stage where once the core draft of the rubric was formed, we went through an iterative process of ensuring that it made sense, was feasible and usable for each of our core roles cross-functionally. And lastly, we socialized that more broadly to ensure that there was alignment and greater understanding overall. So how was it used? We used the rubric as a core part of our user experience research, game milestone, and evaluation process. So at every play test, we were using this as a core tool for assessing how we were doing in terms of DEI, and importantly, how players were feeling about the way that they were being represented or reflected or not represented in our games. And if they weren't, what proactively could we do to ensure that they were better represented, better felt heard and included in our games. A big part of this was actually exploring customization options that could allow players greater autonomy and control over their own experience. So really acknowledging that we necessarily can't have all the answers and instead need to really be actively listening to our players over time and allowing them more agency and autonomy in the journey. So again, we were using this to flag and resolve different DEI issues that might have arisen either through our own internal reviews or through player insights, as well as to promote proactive inclusion. It was then applied through heuristic evaluations and play tests in a more tactical sense, as well as our internal cross-functional reviews. And it was informed in a cross-sector way by using existing Google resources and other industry resources, but also fundamental academic literature in this space to understand what the core theoretical issues were around what we were trying to tackle and address, as well as nonprofit and think tank resources. So this is a quick snapshot of what the process integration looks like. So through our foundational, iterative, and evaluative stages of games user research, we identify these core questions to be asking to ensure that DEI is a core part of how we evaluate our game success and quality, and to ensure that there is an adequate space and a consistent space for player insight and feedback. And so the answers to these questions provide a crucial space for player feedback from a diverse group of users to help ensure that our games are actually contributing actively to an increasingly inclusive gaming culture. So just to wrap this all up, as a quick summary of some of the work that I have been doing in my team, in order to best serve the needs of our players, we took the approach of highlighting our current growth patterns in games, so realizing how increasingly diverse our games should be becoming because of how our player base is growing and developing. And we realized that there was a challenge that we were not serving the next and current generation of games as well as we could be, and as well as the industry could be at large. We knew that all the answers didn't lie within industry or academia alone. And so we sought to combine strengths from both academia, industry, nonprofit organizations, and others to form this kind of multi-method and layered approach that can serve the needs of the next generation of gamers by concretely identifying ways to consistently evaluate DEI in our process and help shift and set high expectations for what inclusion looks like in gaming. So as our communities become more diverse, we hope that the demand and expectation for games to promote inclusive experiences and actual representation for players becomes increasingly paramount. And so grappling with this means embedding these considerations through player insights into our development process to ensure alignment across all of our different roles. Thanks. And now, so we're going to open it up into more of a free-form panel discussion to talk about some of what we just shared, as well as questions we have for each other. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you again, Makeda and Kishonna, for your awesome lightning talks. I'm really glad that we all got to share a little bit about what we're all working on and how we're approaching working in this space together. So let's just open it up for more of an open panel discussion. And we're gonna try to hit a couple of different areas here across cross-sector support and youth work, and also just the big challenge of transforming our current system into one that's more inclusive. So starting with the first area about what's brought us to all be involved in some way in youth work. What inspired you to first partner with youth in your work? I'm gonna go pass it off to Kishonna first.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. And I think what's so fascinating is because the youth actually inspired me to do this project. This was completely an accidental project. I intentionally didn't work with youth because I didn't want to do the IRB and all like the ethics training like that you have to do when you work with youth, right? But it's just like I was so inspired and so moved by their resilience and their tenacity and their motivation because they really had to be self-motivated, because if you think about, across like all these industries, the young folks are they don't see themselves represented. A lot of times they have to take it into their own hands, and that's not only in like the creative industries but in activism as well. So the youth really are leading the charge in most of these things. So my work only my work only exists because of the young folks, right? So when I was down there, just, kind of just, because we love the library hop, when I also want to support like the libraries in our neighborhoods and in our communities, so we were only there, really on accident. But whenever I saw what they were doing, I was just really excited to make sure that I wanted to make sure that what they were doing was legible to academic audiences, but also industry audience too. And that's why I love our panel so much, because we really, we reflect that intersection of, incorporating like the research and connecting with communities and partnering like with folks. And, because like a lot of times it's hard to have like, the community, industry, academia, like partnership. So that's why I love us so much. And I love like the work that we're doing. But I was inspired because the youth inspired me. They said, we ain't waiting for the adults to do nothing for us. We got this ourselves.
I love that. Makeda, do you want to hop in and add?
That was so great, Kishonna. As I'm watching all of your talks and just listening to you all, I'm like, you're my new BFFs. Like, I cannot wait to connect with you all in so many other ways. It's interesting. I was that young girl who loved media, but rarely had opportunities to see myself, right? I love to play games, but rarely had opportunities to see myself in those games. And so I actually started my career in children's media because I had this aha moment. I would love to watch TV shows, but then I would also watch the credits, which was rare for kids probably, right? I would see the credits and realize, wait, there are people who are actually making decisions about what I'm seeing. There are people who are actually making decisions about the characters and the scripting. And I wanted to be one of those decision makers so that I could have an influence in the industry in a way that allowed more kids like me, more kids like others in my community to see themselves. And so my first job actually was at Sesame Street, which I loved because I felt that was the most inclusive street in the world. And it just really grew from there. I've worked at other companies throughout my career. And I specifically remember a time we were creating a game that allowed kids to develop their own avatar. And we had a range of selections from skin tones to hairstyles to clothing. And I remember we took this game into a school in Lower Manhattan. And we were testing it with a girl, and she was, making her selections. And I'll never forget, she turned to me and said that she couldn't find her hairstyle. She couldn't find her hairstyle. So in that moment has always stuck with me because we had done so much due diligence, to have a variety of options available. But if this girl looked at this experience and couldn't see herself, that was a problem, right? That was a problem. And I really recognized then the importance of making sure that I'm always invested in teams, working with teams of people who are willing to let youth have that voice. And I found that luckily in all of the companies with whom I've worked and really been able to establish a rapport, but also a new level of respect for people in the children's media industry because they have shared values in making sure that we're creating the best possible content and putting things out there that allow all kids to see themselves reflected and respected in the most meaningful way.
I love that, Makeda. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, both of your answers have resonated with me so much, and strong +1 to wanting to collaborate together more and more after this. Both of your talks, I think I was frantically trying to take notes and, keeping all these things in mind. But similarly, I think a lot of what has influenced and motivated my current involvement with youth was my own experience as a child. Not necessarily seeing the type of representation and the type of collaboration that I wanted to see, but then in the moments when it did happen, recognizing how powerful that actually really is. I mean, I remember seeing the first Black female roles or characters, title roles that were played in movies and TV shows, and those will still stick with me for a long time. And so being able to play some sort of part in helping that happen and helping that to become more consistent, more expected, helping us all to be able to raise our expectations and our standards there, I think is really powerful. And so my own dissertation work was on youth social media use. So I kind of came into the gaming space by way of more of the digital social media, and then phasing more into interactive media at this point. But in my experience I did a 2-year ethnography for my dissertation with young people at different boys and girls clubs across the Los Angeles and Lafayette, Indiana area. And so much of what Kishonna said has resonated with me in terms of just the pure power in young youth, especially youth that for unfortunate reasons are not served the way that they should be. The way in which they take agency and autonomy into their own hands to really create change for their communities is incredible. I felt like so much of what I wanted to do was kind of just guide and empower and not necessarily come down with top-down mandates of any kind. And so in my current work, I'm really excited about the opportunity to continue to help others realize and recognize that we just need to provide a platform to help further the incredible work that's already going on in those communities and among those groups. So, excellent. Okay, I think I'm going to—
I had a question. Can I ask a question there?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Because I think, I think it's very important. We're talking about like the front end or back end, depending on how you like look at that. What were I think it's important to talk about like our pathways to this work, just as much as like it's important like to see ourselves on the screen. I'm just thinking about how powerful it was, when Makeda said, when she paid attention to the credits and like the people that were behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
How did we end up being the person in the credits? Like, can we each like speak to how, just in case there are some young folks watching and they say, yeah, I want to be like them. How do we get here?
I think that's a great question. Kishonna, do you want to start? I'm curious to hear your—
I'd love to start. So, I think, for, just to remind folks and remind the audience, especially for the young folks that are working here, so I'm an academic. So I have like an academic path, so, I did, graduate school, I got a PhD. And so I have like a tenure track position at a university. So I'm a professor, for those, who are still trying to learn that language. I don't want to assume that because I had no idea what these words meant. I didn't know what a master's degree was. I didn't know what any of that stuff meant. I'm first generation. And so I kind of just happened into this, right? But I also had like, and I think it's important that we recognize the importance of like advisors and mentors and people that are already on this path. And so like I reached out to people. I didn't mind being rejected. I didn't mind doing like those cold calls or cold emails to people to say, hey, you're amazing. You're super cool. I love your work. I want to be connected. And I think social media is like a really great way to like flatten those like the barriers and flatten like the space between folks, right? Because we're more connected. Now, there's no guarantee people are gonna reach back out, because Oprah hasn't responded to my tweets yet, but that's okay. I'm not mad at Oprah, but I just think that it's important that, because and we have so many models, like young folks have so many more models. Like I'm thinking back when we were younger. So I'm an 80s kid, so I wouldn't have imagined seeing like a panel full of Black women like in the early 90s. Like that would just be beyond, that just didn't happen, right? Oprah was our woman, Oprah was like, our person, that we look to. But there are so many like examples. But I would say, advice like to give to folks is like, identify maybe the people whose work inspires you or whose work that you like. Go to their LinkedIn page, see what their pathways are. If they go to conferences, try to attend those things. Things are virtual now. Hopefully, like the cost of access is lower now, because of it. But I would say you try to get access. Internships are important. Making sure that you follow passions. Passions is also very important, right? So if the thing that I majored in is not the thing that I'm doing right now either, and I also think that people will need to make sure that, you can't be scared of like change and things like that. So, but just make sure that folks are, like flexible enough, and also just identify those role models and like, you just have a pathway, but also forge your own path too. Okay. I'm shutting up. I got excited with this. I want to hear y'all's pathway to this. Cause I just really nerding out, geeking out. I just happened into this life.
I love that. I love that. And as you're talking, Kishonna, I'm like, you are speaking my truth. I mean, so much of what you said is my story because, as I mentioned, I was watching those credits, but I was watching the credits at a time where I didn't have DVR, right? There was no on demand where I could like slow down, pause. So literally I had my little notebook there and I was trying to like look up, write the names down really fast, and then if I turned away for a second, I had to make sure I came back the next day to get the names that I missed. And I would literally go to the phone book and make cold calls. They had no idea who I was, right? They had no reason to take my call. Some of them, frankly, didn't take my call, but all you need is one yes. All you need is one yes. And so I had the opportunity to meet with a man by the name of David Cohen, who allowed me to come in. And my request was simple. It was just for an informational interview. That's all I wanted. And when you were talking about interviews and internships, and I actually had never even heard of an informational interview until I was in graduate school. And at that time, I was appalled that no one in my whole life had ever even told me, why don't you have an informational interview? I'm like, why didn't I know about this? It felt like this magical thing. So now whenever I speak to someone, make sure you have the informational interview, right? There's no pressure, but it's an opportunity for you to connect with people who might be doing something that you are interested in. Find out, when you're talking about pathways, right? What was their pathway? Because their pathway might become a blueprint for you to follow as you think about how you want to get into that career. And so I had an informational interview with David. That led to an internship, and the internship led to a freelance position. Freelance led to a full-time position. And so that was really my journey into children's media. And it just continued to grow from there. But it was a risk because I was following my passion. There was no set path. I didn't have anyone in my family. I had no close friends who had done anything like this, but I just knew this is what I was passionate about. And this is what I was going to pursue, because deep down, I felt like I just knew this was part of my life's purpose. And so in terms of what I would recommend for anyone, no matter how old you are, how young you are, it is never too late to follow your passion. It is never too late to live in your purpose. And so when you find that thing that you are called to do, answer. And don't be afraid to start with an informational interview, because the worst someone can say is no. And all you need is one yes.
I think that's so excellent. Definitely want to strongly emphasize that all you need is one yes. I think that for me, that went all the way back to probably even like high school and undergrad as well, because I would hear that with like, all you need is one yes. And then all you need is, to some extent, one person that you look up to, that inspires you, that is maybe at least, whether directly or tangentially, a part of the path that you want to see. I feel like I very much attached myself to that and said, who are people that I can try to reach out to or look up to that are involved in some of these spaces. So I knew I wanted to be involved in media in some way ever since I was probably in junior high. I wanted to become a journalist at the time, so that shifted a little bit. I actually ended up starting to go to college for journalism, but ended up just talking to more professors, talking to other people in my department, and took a research class, research methods class, and the whole thing was history. I mean, I fell in love with research entirely. And one of the professors that I ended up speaking with a lot just after class, asking additional questions, things like that, was a wonderful mentor in applying to graduate programs afterwards. And I owe a lot, I think, to her in that path. So wanted to strongly emphasize that as well, as a way to continue to follow your own passions. Is don't be afraid to, as Makeda, you just said, reach out to people that you know, but don't be afraid also to reach out to people who inspire you even in your day-to-day. Okay.
I think that's fantastic. I can do it, Jennifer, because I know you just answered. So I'll go ahead and hop in there and ask that the next question. What I think it's also important, like for us to like talk about like the benefits and challenges that we've like faced in doing this work, from our pathways or from already being like, on our journey, or already being, in the work that we're doing. What have been some of the like the benefits and challenges that y'all have experienced in trying to get people on board and trying to get, like stakeholders and people invested? You all want to like speak, I think it's important for us to speak to that as well.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So there are many, I think, on either end. So I think one of the benefits to incorporating youth is that it's often, it might sound too reductive to say this, but they often offer a really fresh perspective. Like I think every time that I've worked with youth, whether it's in a research set, like a more traditional academic research setting, or in my industry work, I always come away thinking about things a little bit differently. I think part of that is just being different generations. Sometimes you're just forced out of your own kind of box of thinking. And that's been really, really powerful. And a second part, well, I'll jump to challenges so that we have a chance to all speak on this. But that's one of the big benefits. I would say a core challenge is translating sometimes that work in a way that everyone else, especially cross-functional stakeholders, really understands and can use kind of actionably. So I'm happy to expand on that, but I only have a few minutes left, so I'll pass it along to all of you.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Jennifer. I think it's interesting when we think about working with kids, because it's something that I do every day in my work, but also at home. I'm a mom of 3 kids. And so, they're in my life in all different aspects. But one of the things that I love about it from a professional standpoint is that they're so honest. And so you really get that unfiltered view of how they're saying things. Although I've been working in the kid industry for my entire career, it's been a long time since I've been a kid. So being able to look at things through their lens is one of the most important things that we do in consumer insights. And so they'll tell you if something is working, they'll let you know. And if it's not working, they will also let you know, right? But it's that honest, unfiltered truth that helps us make things better. And my role in insights has always been of interest to me because I've never had one day that has ever been the same as the next. Every day is different, but part of the challenge in that is, to your point about having to translate those insights, right? Making sure you get it right, because kids are coming in, we're going out there, we're connecting with them via multiple platforms, but they're not in that boardroom. They're not saying, well, here's what I think. And so the fact that I'm able to bring these insights into that room to translate what they're saying and hopefully have everyone on board to execute that is a huge responsibility, right? Because I need to make sure that I am getting it right, that I'm not giving fluff, that I'm not sugarcoating, that I'm actually speaking their truth, because their voice is what matters. And if we want to create the best possible content for this generation of kids and those moving forward, we have to make sure their voice is represented in the most honest and authentic way. And Kishonna, I'm sure you experienced that too, working with your students.
Absolutely. And I know we're winding down, because I know we're running out of time, but I think it's just really important that you all said, about the honesty that kids have, but also because, if they might not have anybody like to speak for them or on their behalf, let me say that, and to make things like legible, because I know a lot of times, people don't take like youth like serious, but, so it's taken a lot of energy to get people to take like the work that I'm doing like seriously, because of the larger ramifications that it has on like addressing structural inequalities and different kinds of barriers, addressing legacies of like redlining and racism and all that stuff. So I think it's really important that they the young folks have like the people like us that can help make that work like legible to industry stakeholders and to corporate stakeholders and to academic stakeholders, because nobody will be paying attention to them like if we weren't here in a lot of cases. So then they'll take to the streets, as a lot of them do. They're gonna start the uprising for us, and we're behind them, like supporting them, because like you said, they if we're not listening, they will demand that we listen to them. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that. So I think we have time for maybe a lightning round of one more question just to wind down. So as a summary, I think I'll ask all of us, let's say maybe in like 5 to 10 seconds, what do you think is the most important thing that people watching right now, especially who have a say, in these decisions, whether it's industry or academia, what's the most important thing that you would like to communicate to them to help make gaming spaces more inclusive? Makeda, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. I would say, take a look inward, right? We know that we're serving an external audience, but look inward to see who's in your room, who's part of your decision-making process. What does your table look like? And if your table is not diverse enough, get a bigger table. This is not the time to make any excuses. We have come too far and we still have a ways to go. And so I would challenge each of us in this industry to make sure that we are doing our part to put our best foot forward and be mindful of the connections, the inclusive nature of communities, and also knowing that we're not going to compromise, right? Production, of course, it matters. We have to get things out the door, but in order for it to be ready, it has to be right.
And I would say just have the courage to be different. Well, first, just have the courage to be, and then also have like the courage to like be different. I think that's the other thing that so many folks are, especially with like the in my circles, like so many people are scared to be different, or scared to have like a creative imagination, scared because they are like, okay, this is the template. I have to fit this template in order to get that job. I have to fit this template to get into school, and I have to fit this. But I'm like, if you just have the passion and the energy, you will be able to sell yourself. You'll be able to sell that thing and to let them know, hey, I'm the thing that you need right now. now. My product is the thing that you need right now. My intervention is the thing that you need right now. My book is the thing that you need right now. And I think that that's very important that we just have, like just that courage to just be different and to just exist and reside. And, and then that we'll find each other. We'll find our spaces. We'll find the community that will also support us and allow us to thrive in those spaces.
Excellent, excellent. Such a strong +1 to both of those points. And I would add to that, ensure that you're really listening to and empathizing with either the people that you're studying, the people that you're creating products for, whatever the context may be. Ensure that you're listening and empathizing, but in an explicit way. So not just kind of in closed sessions, but have a process for that. Have a process for incorporating their decision-making or their ideas and their perspectives. Because often, like Kishonna, you just said, it can take you in different directions, and don't be afraid to go in those different directions. And as you said, Makeda, it can help motivate to an expansion of that table, that decision-making table. I mean, they will be, I think, often the first to point out that, oh, this, this doesn't really resonate or isn't as diverse as it could be. So that's how I'll wrap up there. And I think we are out of time at this point, but thank you so much, both of you, for joining this discussion. And thank you everyone who is out there watching. We're really excited to be able to share all of this with you, and have a great rest of South by Southwest.